What if I told you that every parable you've ever heard was actually a sophisticated mind control technique disguised as a simple story? That religious leaders, politicians, and master manipulators have been using the same psychological warfare for thousands of years, and you've been their unwitting target? Today, we're going to decode the hidden manual of persuasion that's been operating right in front of you this entire time. By the end of this video, you'll never hear another story the same way again, because what you're about to discover will fundamentally change everything you thought you knew about influence, power, and the very nature of how your mind processes reality itself. Here's something most people completely miss about parables. They think these stories are just simple moral lessons wrapped in cute metaphors. A farmer plants seeds, a shepherd finds lost sheep, a king forgives debts. Innocent children's stories, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. What you're actually looking at is the most sophisticated persuasion technology ever developed by human beings. Think about it. Why would the most influential figures in history choose to teach through stories instead of just giving direct commands? Why didn't Jesus just say, "Be good to each other," instead of crafting elaborate tales about good Samaritans? Why didn't Buddha simply state, "Attachment causes suffering," instead of weaving complex narratives about princes and beggars? The answer is terrifying and brilliant at the same time. These master persuaders understood something about the human brain that modern neuroscience is only now catching up to. They discovered that stories don't just communicate ideas, they literally rewire how we think. When you hear a parable, your brain doesn't process it as information to be analyzed. It processes it as experience to be lived, and that's where the real power lies. Because while your conscious mind thinks it's just listening to a nice story, your subconscious is being systematically programmed with new beliefs, values, and behavioral patterns. The storyteller becomes the architect of your reality, and you don't even realize you're being constructed. This isn't coincidence. It's psychological warfare disguised as wisdom. Every parable follows the same hidden blueprint, the same neural hijacking sequence that bypasses your rational defenses and plants ideas directly into your unconscious mind. The ancient masters weren't just storytellers. They were master manipulators who understood that the most powerful way to control someone isn't through force or logic, but through the stories they choose to believe about themselves and the world. And once you see this pattern, you can never unsee it. Because suddenly, every parable reveals itself as exactly what it really is. A precision-engineered tool designed to reshape human consciousness without the target ever knowing they've been influenced. The question isn't whether you've been programmed by these stories. The question is, how deep does the programming go? The secret weapon hidden inside every parable is something psychologists call transportation theory. When you hear a story, your brain literally transports you into that narrative world. Your neural pathways start firing as if you're actually experiencing the events being described. This isn't metaphorical. Brain scans show that when someone hears about a character touching sandpaper, the sensory areas of their own brain light up. When they hear about a character running, their motor cortex activates. Your brain can't tell the difference between experiencing something and vividly imagining it. This is why parables are so dangerously effective. They don't argue with your beliefs. They don't present evidence you can debate. Instead, they make you live through an experience that feels completely real, and that experience becomes your new truth. Take the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus didn't say, "Help strangers." He made you experience being beaten, abandoned, and then rescued by an unexpected hero. By the time the story ends, helping strangers isn't just an idea you heard. It's something you've emotionally lived through. Your brain has literally been rewired to include this new experience as part of your personal history. But here's where it gets truly manipulative. Master storytellers like Jesus and Buddha didn't just use random stories. They crafted their parables using specific psychological triggers that guarantee maximum penetration into your unconscious mind. First, they use what's called the identification trap. Every parable contains a character you automatically identify with, usually someone facing a moral choice or difficult situation. This isn't accidental. The storyteller carefully constructs this character to mirror your own psychological profile, your fears, your desires, your internal conflicts. When you identify with this character, you literally merge with them psychologically. Their choices become your choices. Their revelations become your revelations. Second, they employ emotional overwhelm. Notice how every powerful parable contains moments of intense emotion: fear, compassion, rage, joy, despair. These emotional spikes shut down your critical thinking faculties and open direct pathways to your unconscious programming. When you're emotionally activated, you stop analyzing and start absorbing. Third, they use resolution dependency. The parable creates tension that can only be resolved by accepting the hidden message. Your brain craves closure so desperately that it will accept almost any solution that releases the psychological tension the story has created. This is why you feel so satisfied when a parable reaches its conclusion, even if you can't quite explain why. Your unconscious has been programmed, and that programming feels like wisdom. Think of your brain like a medieval castle with massive walls and heavily guarded gates. Direct persuasion attempts are like armies trying to storm those gates. Your conscious mind sees them coming and raises the drawbridge. It marshals your logic, your skepticism, your critical thinking to defend against the invasion. Most influence attempts fail because they trigger these psychological defenses. But parables work like a Trojan horse. They don't attack your mental fortress. Instead, they approach disguised as harmless entertainment, as innocent stories that pose no threat to your existing beliefs. Your psychological guards wave them right through the gates because stories feel safe, familiar, enjoyable. By the time you realize what's happening, the real message has already been delivered deep inside your unconscious mind, where your core beliefs and automatic responses are stored. The story downloads its programming directly into your mental operating system, and there's no antivirus software running at that level. You think you're just enjoying a tale, but you're actually being rebuilt from the inside out. This is why cultures throughout history have used stories as their primary method of transmitting values, beliefs, and behaviors. It's not because stories are easier to remember, though they are. It's because stories bypass the immune system of the rational mind and install their payload directly into the psychological infrastructure that actually controls your decisions. Every time you hear a parable and think, "That's a beautiful story," what you're really experiencing is the moment your brain accepts a new piece of programming. The beauty you feel isn't aesthetic appreciation. It's the satisfaction of successful installation. Your unconscious recognizes that it has just received a new set of instructions, and that recognition generates the emotional response we interpret as wisdom or inspiration. Once you understand this mechanism, you realize that parables aren't teaching tools. They're programming languages for human consciousness. If this is exploding your head, hit that like button so more people can discover these hidden truths. But wait, because the second case is even more shocking. Now that you understand the basic mechanism, let's go deeper into something even more disturbing. Have you ever wondered why certain parables stick with you for years while others fade away immediately? Why some stories change your entire worldview while others barely register? There's a hidden layer to this persuasion technology that most people never discover. The master manipulators didn't just understand how to bypass your conscious defenses. They figured out how to make their programming self-replicating and permanent. They discovered how to create what psychologists now call cognitive viruses, ideas that not only infect your mind, but actively protect themselves from being removed. Every truly powerful parable contains what I call the multiplication factor. This is a psychological mechanism that ensures the story doesn't just change you once. It changes you repeatedly, getting stronger each time you recall it. Think about your favorite parable or story that profoundly impacted you. Have you noticed that every time you remember it, it seems to reveal new layers of meaning? That each retelling deepens its impact rather than diminishing it? This isn't because the story is so profound. It's because the story was engineered to rewrite your neural pathways each time you access the memory. Here's how this works. Master storytellers embed what cognitive scientists call interpretive gaps, deliberate ambiguities that force your brain to actively fill in missing information. When you encounter these gaps, your unconscious doesn't just passively receive the story. It becomes an active participant in creating the meaning. And here's the crucial part. Because you helped create the interpretation, your brain treats it as your own original insight rather than external programming. This creates a sense of ownership that makes the idea virtually impossible to reject. You can't argue against your own discoveries, but it gets worse. These interpretive gaps aren't random. They're strategically placed to target your specific psychological vulnerabilities. The ambiguities are designed to activate your deepest fears, desires, and unresolved conflicts. When your brain fills in these gaps, it automatically uses material from your own psychological profile. The story becomes a mirror that reflects your inner world back to you, but with the storyteller's agenda embedded in the reflection. The most chilling aspect of parable-based persuasion is something called manufactured enlightenment. The ancient masters didn't just want to change your behavior. They wanted to make you believe that their ideas were your own spontaneous realizations. They engineered fake epiphanies. Here's how they did it. Every powerful parable follows what I call the revelation sequence, a carefully orchestrated series of psychological events that culminate in what feels like a profound personal insight. First comes the setup phase. The story establishes a familiar situation that resonates with your personal experience. This creates psychological identification and emotional investment. Your brain starts mapping the story onto your own life circumstances. Next is the complication phase. The story introduces a problem or moral dilemma that mirrors unresolved conflicts in your own psyche. This activates your brain's problem-solving mechanisms and creates mental tension that demands resolution. Then comes the misdirection phase. The story leads you down a path that seems obvious, but is actually designed to frustrate your expectations. This creates cognitive dissonance and emotional frustration, which temporarily disables your analytical thinking. Finally, the revelation phase. The story provides a solution that releases all the accumulated tension in a single moment of apparent clarity. Your brain experiences a massive neurochemical reward for resolving the psychological pressure, and this reward gets associated with the story's hidden message. The genius of this sequence is that the relief you feel doesn't come from understanding the story. It comes from your brain's reward system congratulating you for solving what feels like a complex puzzle. But you weren't solving a puzzle. You were being programmed to accept a predetermined conclusion. The aha moment you experience is artificially manufactured by the story's psychological architecture. Religious leaders, political figures, and master manipulators throughout history have used this exact sequence to implant their agendas directly into people's belief systems. They make you feel like you've discovered profound truths about life, when what you've actually done is accept their programming as your own insight. This is why people become so emotionally attached to ideas they learned from parables. They're not defending beliefs they were taught. They're defending revelations they think they discovered themselves. And the more personal the revelation feels, the more impossible it becomes to question or abandon. The manipulation is complete because the victim has become a willing participant in their own programming. Imagine your mind as a sophisticated computer system with multiple layers of security. Normal persuasion attempts are like hackers trying to break in through the front door. Your conscious awareness detects the intrusion and activates defensive protocols. Your logic, skepticism, and critical thinking work like firewalls, blocking unauthorized access to your core beliefs. But parables function like advanced malware with administrative privileges. They don't break into your system. They trick you into giving them access voluntarily. The story presents itself as entertainment or wisdom, so you willingly open the file and run the program. Once inside, it doesn't immediately start changing your files. Instead, it studies your psychological architecture, learning the layout of your beliefs, fears, and desires. Then it begins making subtle modifications to your mental operating system, changing not what you think, but how you think. The most insidious part is that this malware includes a cloaking function that makes you believe any changes you experience are the result of your own processing power, not external programming. When new ideas appear in your consciousness, they carry signatures that identify them as native thoughts rather than installed software. You think you're having original insights when you're actually executing someone else's code. This is why people who've been influenced by powerful parables often become evangelical about sharing those stories. They're not just passing along ideas they found compelling. They're unconsciously spreading the same programming that infected them, believing they're sharing profound wisdom they discovered through their own enlightenment. The parable has essentially turned them into unwitting distributors of its psychological payload. But here's what makes this truly frightening. Once a parable has successfully installed its programming, it actively defends itself against removal. Any attempt to question or analyze the story triggers the same emotional rewards that made it feel true in the first place. Your brain has been conditioned to interpret criticism of the parable as an attack on your own intelligence and insight. This creates a psychological immune response that actually strengthens the original programming. The deeper you think you understand the story, the more completely it controls your thinking. Subscribe now, because the third case coming next will completely change your perspective on human nature. Here's the most disturbing truth about parable-based persuasion. It's not just ancient history. Modern leaders, influencers, and power brokers have weaponized this technology and are using it against you right now. But they've evolved the technique far beyond what the ancient masters could have imagined. They've discovered how to create meta-parables, stories that don't just program your beliefs, but actually program how you process all future stories. They're not just hacking your current thoughts. They're installing backdoors that give them permanent access to your consciousness. Think about the stories that dominate our culture today. The narratives about success, happiness, relationships, politics, and meaning that we encounter in movies, books, social media, and news. Do you think it's coincidence that these stories all seem to lead to the same conclusions? That they all point toward the same solutions, the same products, the same behaviors, the same political positions? You're not just consuming entertainment. You're downloading psychological software that shapes how you interpret every experience in your life. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. The modern masters have figured out how to create story cascades, interconnected networks of narratives that reinforce each other across multiple platforms and contexts. One story primes you to be receptive to the next story, which amplifies the effect of the third story, which makes you seek out more stories that confirm what you now believe. Each narrative builds on the previous programming, creating layers of mental conditioning that become virtually impossible to undo. Consider how modern influencers use this technique. They don't just tell you what to think. They tell you stories about people who discovered amazing truths, overcame incredible obstacles, or achieved extraordinary success. These stories follow the exact same psychological architecture as ancient parables, but they're designed to make you identify with the journey rather than the destination. You start believing that questioning these narratives means rejecting your own potential for growth, discovery, and achievement. The programming becomes part of your identity. But the most sinister evolution is something I call adaptive storytelling. Modern technology allows story crafters to monitor your responses in real time and adjust their narratives accordingly. They can see which parts of their stories trigger the strongest psychological reactions and modify future content to exploit those specific vulnerabilities. Your own behavioral data becomes the raw material for crafting personalized programming designed specifically for your psychological profile. What we're witnessing today is the emergence of what I call the Great Story War, a hidden battle for control of human consciousness fought entirely through competing narratives. Every major power structure in society has recognized that whoever controls the dominant stories controls the behavior of entire populations. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is documented strategy. Political parties, corporations, religious organizations, and social movements have all explicitly adopted narrative-based persuasion as their primary tool for shaping public opinion and behavior. They understand that facts don't change minds, but stories do. Arguments create resistance, but parables create conversion. This is why we're constantly bombarded with carefully crafted stories about heroes and villains, problems and solutions, victims and saviors. Each narrative is designed to program specific responses to real-world situations. When you encounter actual events, your brain automatically interprets them through the framework of stories you've already absorbed. Your perception of reality becomes completely dependent on which stories have been installed in your psychological operating system. But here's the revelation that changes everything. Once you understand this mechanism, you gain the power to recognize and resist it. The same psychological principles that make parables so effective as programming tools can be used to debug your own consciousness. You can learn to spot the manipulation techniques, identify the hidden agendas, and choose which stories deserve access to your mind. The key is developing what I call narrative immunity, the ability to experience stories without being unconsciously programmed by them. This requires understanding the three levels of every persuasive narrative. First, the surface level. What the story appears to be about. Second, the psychological level. What emotional and mental responses the story is designed to trigger. Third, the agenda level. What behaviors, beliefs, or responses the story is actually engineered to produce. When you can analyze all three levels simultaneously, stories lose their hypnotic power over you. You can appreciate their artistry without surrendering your autonomy. You can learn from their insights without adopting their programming. But most importantly, you can begin crafting your own narratives, stories that serve your genuine values and authentic goals rather than someone else's agenda. This is the ultimate revelation. The power to program yourself rather than being programmed by others. When you master the technology of parable-based persuasion, you don't just become immune to manipulation. You become capable of consciously designing your own belief systems, your own meaning-making frameworks, your own psychological architecture. The stories you choose to live by become the foundation of the reality you create. Picture human civilization as a vast digital network where every person is both a computer and a router. For thousands of years, certain nodes in this network have been running sophisticated algorithms designed to spread specific types of information throughout the entire system. These aren't just sharing data, they're installing operating systems that determine how every other node processes and responds to all future information. The ancient masters were the original programmers who wrote the foundational code that still runs on billions of human minds today. They discovered that the most effective way to propagate their programs wasn't through direct transmission, but through self-replicating stories that would spread organically from person to person, generation to generation. Each parable functions like a perfectly designed virus that carries psychological DNA capable of rebuilding entire belief systems from the inside out. Modern power structures have reverse-engineered this ancient technology and weaponized it at unprecedented scale. They've created what amounts to a psychological internet, where competing narratives battle for bandwidth in human consciousness. The stories that achieve viral dominance become the collective operating system that shapes how entire societies think, feel, and behave. But here's your advantage. Once you understand that you're living inside a story war, you can choose which narratives get administrative access to your mind. You can run antivirus software that detects manipulative programming before it installs. Most importantly, you can begin writing your own code, crafting personal narratives that serve your authentic values rather than someone else's agenda. This is the ultimate form of psychological sovereignty. The recognition that your consciousness is programmable, and therefore you have the right and responsibility to choose your own programmers. When you stop being a passive recipient of other people's stories and start becoming an active architect of your own narrative reality, you transform from a program node into a conscious programmer. The question isn't whether you'll be influenced by stories. The question is whether you'll choose those stories consciously or accept them unconsciously. Your mind is going to run some kind of narrative operating system. You might as well make sure it's one that serves your highest potential rather than someone else's hidden agenda. These three revelations expose the hidden architecture of human influence that's been operating in plain sight for millennia. Every parable you've ever heard was a precision tool designed to reprogram your consciousness. But now you possess the knowledge to recognize, resist, and even reverse engineer this technology for your own authentic growth. If these revelations exploded your mind, smash that like button and subscribe to discover more hidden truths. Comment below, which case shocked you most? Hit the notification bell so the algorithm serves you truth instead of manipulation. And if someone you know needs to see this, share it, because psychological sovereignty is too important to keep secret. Until next time, stay conscious, stay questioning, and remember, the stories you choose to believe become the reality you're forced to live.